This discussion of national culture hopefully is a refresher for you. For those of you that may not have had this, get everybody up to speed on what this is. This is based on Hofstede's cultural dimensions: individualism, power difference, power distance, uncertainty, avoidance, masculinity, and to some extent long-term orientation. He added long-term orientation in later research. And you can see where there's these country clusters, if you will: the Far East, the Near East, Latin America, etc. All of these groups, really vary in where they fall in this continuum, for all of these dimensions. And you can see why, again, if you're sort of digging into this, why there might be some tensions and challenges when you've got different groups coming from different perspectives. If you've got a group that's really different to authority, and then you have another group that challenges everything, that creates conflict, right? And if you've got a group that's very masculine and a group that's very feminine, again, more conflict. We run into many, many problems around this. So this is just a great visualization of what that looks like in terms of some of the challenges that we may face. This slide gets into a little bit more detail on the different dimensions. In terms of power distance, where do we see African countries versus Arab countries and Anglo and Germanic countries, etc., and where does the U.S. fall within that? The U.S. falls at a 40. It's on the low end. We have less concern. We have some respect for differences in the power and authority, but for the most part, we're much more egalitarian than the Latin American and Asian countries are. And in terms of the individualistic collectivist, the U.S. is the highest possible in terms of individualism, the highest ranked in countries, and other countries like Latin America and Africa and some Asian countries are much more collectivistic. And again, when you're in a culture that's about looking out for yourself versus a culture that's looking out for your neighbor all the time, you can see the tensions that may arise in terms of the kinds of decisions that we make and the way that we manage our people, on a daily basis. The other dimensions of national culture cover things like uncertainty avoidance or time orientation and the masculinity versus femininity of a particular culture. And again, uncertainty avoidance is the comfort that we have with ambiguity, and how much do we feel the need to have rules and policies in place in order to get rid of as much ambiguity as possible. And the U.S. is much more comfortable with ambiguity than some other countries. For example, Latin American countries and some East Asian countries are very uncomfortable with uncertainty, and so they try to have very clear rules in place in order to minimize all that ambiguity and that challenge. And the same thing with masculinity and femininity. U.S. is a little bit more masculine than it is feminine, but feminine cultures like Sweden believe in egalitarianism and equality, and that there aren't men's jobs and women's jobs, there's just jobs and people do them. That's why we see in a lot of the Scandinavian countries, family and medical leave and things like that, is not even questioned. Where here in the U.S. it's always a challenge. There's no sense of that being aggressive and assertive is valued all the time, and that's not always the case. Feminine cultures tend to be much more focused on collectivism and everybody getting along and working sure everything is fair for people. And masculine cultures are much more about being assertive and being competitive and stuff like that. And yes, those fall along stereotypes, if you will, but that's, we can call them whatever you want, whether masculine and feminine is the right term or whether it's just assertive versus non-assertive. I don't know how you would want to call it, but there are some clear differences in the way people conduct themselves in the workplace. Japan is very masculine, the U.S. is sort of mid-range, and yet Chile is very very feminine, as is the Scandinavian countries. And so imagine trying to do business with these groups, trying to manage people, and if you come from a masculine culture, trying to manage people who are much more feminine, you're going to get a lot of kickback for that. Last thing is on the time orientation. We here in the United States tend to have a very short-term orientation where we're more focused on sort of the here and now. Long-term orientation cultures tend to be more on the Asian philosophy, where they really think much more long-term about the implications for things. And then the low-term orientation are Africa, Latin America, and things like that. We really don't think enough about the future implications of what we do. We're much more sort of in that here and now, and maybe that's part of the instant gratification culture or what have you, I don't know, but we tend to be much more focused on the short term as opposed to the long term. So in terms of some of these demographic differences that we've already made reference to, those internal dimensions, if you will, I think it's important to take a few minutes to discuss some of these issues. Number one, this idea that we're post-racial, or that ethnicity and color and race don't matter, and we know that's not true. Yes, there are different ethnicities, but we've created this concept that race actually matters, and race is actually, most social scientists will argue that race is a social construct. There is no such genetic thing as race. There's genetic things as ethnicity, but in terms of race, less so. Very little evidence to support that. So, again, we've created this social construct that people are a different race from us, so therefore we are making attributions to this group collectively, and we know that's not true. And those collective attributions are stereotypes, right? They're the assumption that everybody is the same because they all have the same race or the same ethnicity or the same skin color, and we know that's not true. But discrimination is still prevalent, and we can see this even if it's implied through this thing called the implicit association test, and it's Project Implicit out of Harvard University. And with Project Implicit, basically what we're looking at is not the explicit issues of discrimination or racism or sexism that we might consciously be aware of, but it's more the implied, and that implied is a reflection of the messages that we get from society about what is considered good and what is not good. We get messages that women in science is not good and that men in science is good. We get messages that, black is bad and white is good, that Asian is a good minority versus, Latinos that are lazy, quote unquote. And I don't believe in any of those stereotypes, mind you. But you can see these are the messages that society gives us all the time, and you can see it even in our political arena, where we hear politicians talking in broad generalizations about different groups. And so there's these implicit associations that we make, that this is good and this is not good, and we have these built-in biases that we might not even be consciously aware of. So Project Implicit, their goal is to sort of make people aware of these implicit associations that we make around race, sex, and ethnicity, and things like that. And the more that we're aware of where our biases are, the easier it is for us to sort of bring more consciousness to it and make better decisions. So we want to be careful about the tendency to stereotype. It's easy to stereotype because that's what our brain wants to do. It wants to lump everything into a category to make it simple and easy. And so, of course, it's really easy for us to come up with a stereotype of what this group is supposed to be like or that group is supposed to be like. It's a natural tendency. But the hope is that with our own cognitions, we can rise above these stereotypes and these implicit associations and make ourselves aware of these challenges. And when we do that, then we're much more likely to bring consciousness to it and enable us to not engage in those stereotypes. The glass ceiling is a great example of challenges that people of different racial, ethnic, and color-based groups, and women also face. There's a barrier, an invisible barrier. They get to go up so high, and then they're just not accepted into that inner circle to be able to make the leap into the higher levels of management, and it's a problem. The other issues, as we've already sort of talked about, is these affirmative action myths. This idea that, affirmative action is about giving people a leg up that don't deserve it or that haven't worked hard, or, everybody should have the same opportunities, and, why should they be given a special preference? Well, again, the assumption is we all come from the same sort of broad-based background, that everybody, had access to the same equal education and resources growing up. And so affirmative action is about making sure that, nobody gets left behind, that there is opportunity for everybody. And when we attract diverse people, we still have to compete to be the best. And so the goal of affirmative action isn't to hire necessarily people who are in those protected categories, but it's to make sure that we have a diverse pool to pull from, and that we have to hire then the best person for that job no matter what. There are a lot of assumptions that people make around race or ethnicity. We somehow believe or hope to believe that we are, a post-racial society, that really race and ethnicity and things like this don't matter anymore, but it still does. That DWB that you see on the slide there is called driving while black. And driving while black is a serious phenomenon. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in class when we start talking about privilege and some of the challenges around privilege, but we have to recognize that African Americans, particularly African American males, are more likely to be pulled over for no reason whatsoever. Now, I included the Henry Louis Gates situation here because Henry Louis Gates was harassed by the local police for trying to actually get into his own home. He had left his keys somewhere, and he was trying to break into his home to get back into the house where he lived. And somebody reported him to the police, and the police came and arrested him and harassed him. And of course, he mouthed off back, and became a major argument and an encounter, and unfortunately the man ended up in jail for it. And on the one hand, you can say, well, he shouldn't have mouthed off, but why would the assumption be that he's breaking into his own house? If it were a white man in a suit, no one would have questioned it, but it was a black man in a suit, and therefore they assumed he was breaking into it. And these are the sort of fundamental assumptions that we have to be really careful about around issues of race. Other things that we might see and might be aware of in organizations is this idea of, history months, these history months, and it's Black History Month or Latino History Month or Asian History Month, and these histories are really important for us to understand and embrace, and a lot of our groups, our affinity groups, sort of try to address the issues that these groups might feel collectively, and it's important that we focus on them in that manner. I love the genderbread person because it really does try to get at these constructs, if you will, that people tend to lump together as sort of one thing. Let me start with the one in the middle, which says biological sex. People assume that there's only two sexes. There's a male and there's a female. But what people don't realize is that there's an enormous amount of variability in terms of genetic makeup, where there may be all sorts of combinations of genes. You can have XXY, XYY. There's not any one way to be. It's either XX or XY. I mean, I think our science does a big injustice to the prevalence of people who identify as intersexed, who have different chromosomal makeups that present them in very different ways. So we have to be really careful. There may be also situations where someone is genetically male, but because they have a sensitivity to, all sorts of hormones, their body doesn't react to it the way they should. They present as female as opposed to male, or vice versa. They present as male instead of female. And this is not necessarily issues of being transgender. We'll talk about gender identity in a few seconds, but this is about the basic genetics. There is a larger population than anyone would be telling you that are in the column of intersexed, or I wouldn't even say it's a column, it's just a group, that are intersexed. And so anybody that tells you that there's only male and only female, it really is doing a disservice to that group that's in between, that experiences all sorts of different ways of presenting themselves. In terms of sexual orientation, again, I think people sort of get that you can be heterosexual, where you are attracted to the opposite sex. You can be homosexual, where you are attracted to the same sex. But then you have bisexual, which is in that middle ground, where, in fact, they're attracted to anybody. I mean, and I don't mean that in a way that assumes that they're always looking to hook up. I mean, it's a fallacy. But a bisexual is someone who really doesn't care about the form that person is in. It could be male, it could be female. And if you really want to get into it and even more intensely, you could talk about someone who's pansexual. And someone who's pansexual is comfortable with male, female, someone who's genderqueer, someone who may be intersexed and has ambiguous genitalia. it doesn't matter to them. They love the person, the entity, the spirit of that individual, regardless of the body form that it's in. And so orientation, again, is also a continuum, and that nobody is completely heterosexual or completely homosexual either. There's a continuum from one end to the other, as Kinsey taught us. So there's orientation. So biological sex, orientation is the heart, the affinity that we have, and then we have gender identity. And this has really a lot to do with how you feel inside of you, chemically, or the chemistry, the hormones, what have you. When you look in the mirror and someone says you're a woman, and you look in the mirror and you say, I don't feel like a woman, I'm a man, I'm a boy. This is the challenge of gender identity. It's what you feel like inside. When you look in the mirror, it doesn't match. And there's an enormous amount of biological evidence for someone identifying as female in a man's body and identifying as a male in a female's body. That's the transgender continuum, right? Someone who's genderqueer really doesn't identify either way. They just feel very gender fluid. There are moments when they feel more masculine, more like a man, other times they feel more like a woman, or it just sort of doesn't matter. And that's just the way their expression is. But there's tremendous evidence out there where you are in the womb, how much you were flooded with female hormones, how many brothers you have. There's a biological basis for identity, gender identity expression, gender identity, biological sex, and sexual orientation. Tremendous biological evidence to support that this is not a binary, that there's a whole continuum of experiences. Lastly is gender expression, which has nothing to do with your sex that you're born to, your genetics, the people that you love, or your general identity. I mean, I can feel like a female or feel like a male. But gender expression is, do I behave more femininely or more masculinely? We call women who tend to be more masculine, we call them tomboys, right? We call boys who tend to be more feminine sissies. And it doesn't mean that they're necessarily attracted, they're either lesbian or gay. It has nothing to do with who they have an affinity to, but it's how they choose to express themselves, more feminine or more masculine. On one day they can be more feminine, another day more masculine. Our society has very clear boundaries around what is feminine, what is masculine, and we're not supposed to cross that boundary. And that's part of the challenge. We want to put people into a box and assume that they have to behave in a particular way in order for me to feel comfortable, and in fact it doesn't quite work that way. People are entitled to express a whole range of behaviors, whatever is comfortable for them, and we shouldn't have to feel like people have to behave in a particular way or fit into a box in order to be able to do that.